ABC News.
The British Prime Minister says people should get their COVID-19 jab when it's offered, as these concerns remain about those potential side effects of the AstraZeneca vaccine. I've been speaking with the British broadcaster and commentator Jonathan Sacerdoti about the situation in the UK.
Well, the government's decision to lift lockdown measures is in line with what they said they were hoping to do, as long as the infection rates went down adequately and as long as the vaccination rates went up adequately. So when Boris Johnson did announce that they were going to hit their target date, that meant that those things were in place. And obviously for British people, it's a huge relief. Nobody likes being in lockdown, whether it's over there in Australia or over here in the UK. People are looking forward to a degree of freedom to do things in their lives like they used to. But I say a degree because in some ways it's still not what any of us would have thought about as freedom even a year and a half ago. You know, being told that you're allowed to meet people outdoors, or a certain number of households are allowed to mix in a garden, or you're allowed to go for a drink at the pub, but only if you stay in the garden. These are not exactly the kind of things that we once thought would equal freedom.
It's been an extraordinary time, hasn't it? I mean, as someone who is British joining us from London, paint us a picture of what it has been like over the past year in what's normally, of course, a bustling city.
Yeah, it's been really tough. And I think the thing that's often talked about here is that this has hit some people much harder than others. And unfortunately, quite often those people have been the people least prepared or able to deal with this sort of thing. Lockdowns are not something any of us ever thought would be part of our lives until very recently. But if you're working in a 0 hours contract, or you have a low income and you find that you've got to isolate yourself because somebody you came into contact with has tested positive, that's obviously going to have a massive effect on your life in a way that it might not for somebody in different circumstances. But that's not to say it hasn't been tough across the board. It's been really tough for everyone, from homeschooling over Zoom for families with multiple kids. That's had practical considerations like how many devices they have and how many rooms they have to sit their different kids in, at the same time as trying to work from home. Often one parent, sometimes two, often trying to figure out how they can all work in different places in a restricted space at the same time. So these sorts of things are common to all of us around the world. But here in London, as the weather is getting nicer, spring is here, though it does keep not quite deciding whether to be sunny or to snow at the moment. People are looking forward to being able to go out, to being able to see each other, to being able to return to some degree of normality. And I'll have to tell you personally, above all else, to being able to have a haircut.
I can imagine. And when we look at the road out of this, the roadmap, as Boris Johnson's been calling it, one of the initiatives is for all adults to have access to twice weekly rapid tests. I mean, how significant is a move like that when it comes to getting things back to normal?
I think it's a huge part of his strategy. So the various parts of the strategy are coming together now as things are mapped out going forwards. So one of the things they're talking about is possibly vaccine passports. Britain's doing very well in its vaccination race, much better than most of the EU countries. In fact, all of the EU countries. Britain managed to squeeze out of the EU just in time with Brexit in order to procure its own vaccines and pursue its own vaccine policy. And it did pursue its own vaccine policy. We're waiting 12 weeks between doses of the vaccines, and the original advice from the manufacturers of them was to have a 3-week gap. Now, that's something that British scientists decided to do so that they could maximise the number of people who had at least one vaccine, giving them often 80-something% protection, and then giving them the second after 12 weeks. That's been a smart move because it's increased the numbers who've managed to be vaccinated here. And the testing is the other side of that coin. If you can test people regularly, if the tests are quick and easy, can even be done at home. So we're not talking PCR tests, but we are talking swab tests that are analysed at home in a sort of pregnancy test style way. Those will help people, if they're able to do them once or twice a week, to catch if they are asymptomatic carriers of the virus and enable them to isolate. Of course, there's an awful lot of ifs involved in this because people have to do it. They have to do it properly. And some people don't administer these tests properly, even with the best of intentions. And they then have to refrain from going to work and seeing other people for 2 weeks. These are all a lot of big asks, but they are things that will help people get back to normal and help beat the virus.
So when we talk about vaccine passports and self-testing, is there any sense of when international travel might resume to any sense of the way it was before?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, I think. Perhaps a lot more than $1 million if you look at the airline and holiday industry.
Yeah, yeah.
Boris Johnson is keen not to call them vaccine passports, but that's what we're all calling them. He prefers COVID status certifications. Part of the reason for that is that while he said they will become part of our lives for certain things that we need to use them for, it's not yet clear exactly when they'll be used, whether you'll need one to go to the pub or not, for example. They're running lots of pilots. They're trying to see if they can help people go back to mass sporting events. They say they will be used there. And of course, airline travel is one of the places where they're bound to be used. At the moment, we have to have vaccines to go to certain countries anyway. So the idea of having COVID vaccines to go, well, just about anywhere isn't necessarily a huge leap. In fact, Boris Johnson said surgeons have to show they're vaccinated against hepatitis B in order to do their job. And so this isn't such a departure from those sorts of things in other areas of life. He said that he was still hoping Britons might be able to start international travel again on May the 17th. But he certainly wasn't promising it. And yesterday, when he announced all of this, it was too soon for him to give any kind of roadmap of when this would happen. But that is the magic date people are clinging to at the moment. And many people are booking holidays for shortly after that, hoping that they'll be able to go away. But of course, even when there is air travel and international travel back in place, it will only be to countries that are considered what they're calling green rather than green, amber and red. Green meaning low rates of coronavirus, high rates of vaccination, and very importantly, no surprise variants of the coronavirus appearing in those countries, which might scupper the vaccination program here. And so far, there aren't many of those on our doorstep. As I said, Europe's doing pretty terribly with many countries going into third wave lockdowns, while Britain is trying to avoid that. But there's been a piece of advice rather scarily here from the scientists that it's a question of when, not if.
When we look at the vaccine rollout in the UK then, have you been getting the sense that there's much vaccine hesitancy over this, particularly the Oxford AstraZeneca jab? And we've heard a lot of concerns about that here in terms of its potential link to blood clots, for example.
That's right. Certainly that's been the workhorse of the British vaccination programme. We've been given Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines. In the beginning, it was mostly Pfizer, and then it quickly switched to the homemade Oxford-researched AstraZeneca ones. Now, there have been over 31.6 million people in the UK who've had their first dose. That's around 60% of the adult population. And 5.4 million have had a second dose now. Of course, that will vary as the supply of the vaccines varies as well. And if these new warnings about the AstraZeneca vaccine mean that certain age groups, or even possibly women or men, aren't being given it in favor of a different vaccine, that will in turn vary how quickly they can vaccinate people. But I think it's a balancing act of supply and demand, and also safety. As they find out more about possible side effects like these blood clots, which they say are vanishingly rare but are a real concern, it now seems, they need to make these decisions about what's more important, vaccinating more people to get rid of the virus and subdue it, or keeping every single person more safe. Of course, in terms of medicine and vaccination, it's both. And that's why the regulators are very keen to follow all the evidence. And as they see evidence arising that there could be a problem with certain people having blood clots in very rare cases, they'll try to avoid giving those people that vaccine.
British broadcaster and commentator Jonathan Sacerdoti joining me earlier there from London.